When I first read the case file on Dorothea Puente, I remember feeling uneasy, not because of what she did, but because of how ordinary she seemed. A grandmotherly woman in pastel sweaters, smiling softly behind large glasses, running a quiet boarding house in Sacramento. No blood, no weapons, no chaos, just tea, cookies, and bodies buried in her garden. It's the kind of evil that whispers instead of screams. The first time investigators entered her home, they were struck by the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon. The living room was tidy, filled with lace curtains and religious icons. But beneath that domestic calm lay one of the most chilling examples of psychological manipulation and emotional control I've ever seen in a criminal mind. Dorothea Puente wasn't driven by rage or impulse. She was driven by power through dependency, the need to dominate others by appearing to care for them. And that, psychologically, is one of the most deceptive forms of evil there is. I always begin analyzing her story from her early life because that's where the blueprint forms. Dorothea was born in 1929 into neglect and instability. Both parents were alcoholics. Her father died young, her mother in an accident soon after. She grew up in orphanages and foster homes where affection was conditional and survival depended on charm. That kind of childhood can rewire the brain's relationship with trust. Many children from abusive environments learn to equate affection with control, to believe that love is something you must manufacture to stay safe. For Dorothea, manipulation became not only a survival tool but eventually her identity. By her 20s, she had already learned that kindness could be transactional. She married multiple times, took advantage of partners, and even served time for fraud. Every time she was caught, she reshaped herself, like a chameleon adapting to a new environment. To social workers, she was a caretaker. To tenants, a savior. To herself, a director of lives deciding who deserved comfort and who deserved silence. When she finally settled into her modest Victorian home on F Street in Sacramento, she built what looked like a haven for society's forgotten. The elderly, the disabled, the addicted. People others ignored. That boarding house became her stage, and every tenant her captive audience. From the outside, she was generous, offering food, medication, and stability to people who had none. But beneath that surface ran a deep vein of narcissistic control. She selected her residents carefully. They were people who wouldn't be missed, whose families were distant, whose social ties were fragile. In psychology, we call that target selection through vulnerability scanning, a trait common among manipulative offenders. Her victims trusted her because she fulfilled a primal need: safety. Once she established emotional dominance, she handled their finances for convenience. The power dynamic shifted completely. They depended on her for money, medication, and approval. That dependency was the psychological leash she used to tighten control. When I listen to the tapes from her later interrogations, what stands out most is her composure. No panic, no guilt, only confusion that anyone could see her as a villain. She described her actions in gentle tones, using words like help, care, and protect. In her mind, she wasn't a predator, she was a misunderstood mother figure. That self-image reveals the core of her psychology: malignant caretaking. It's a paradoxical disorder where empathy is weaponized. The perpetrator gains satisfaction not from physical violence but from absolute control masked as compassion. Every smile, every plate of food, every comforting word was a psychological thread pulling her tenants deeper into dependency. She wasn't motivated by sadism in the traditional sense. There was no pleasure in suffering. What she enjoyed was the authority of mercy. The ability to decide when someone ate, when they slept, how much medication they received. Control became her currency, and she spent it lavishly. By the time police discovered the first shallow grave in her garden, she had perfected the role of innocence. I've listened to interviews where she jokes with officers, even offering them coffee as they dig through her backyard. It's a level of detachment that only comes from a lifetime of rehearsed performance. That's something many people misunderstand about sociopathic personalities. They don't snap, they perform. Their emotional responses are rehearsed, not felt. Puente's laughter, her gentle voice, the way she folded her hands, all of it was choreography. Underneath was a cold, analytical mind keeping score of every advantage gained. When confronted with evidence, she didn't deny with anger. She deflected with politeness. "You must be mistaken," she'd say softly, eyes lowered, as if humility could erase a crime scene. That calmness is classic psychopathic affect regulation, a limited emotional range allowing her to manipulate by contrast. While others panicked, she appeared serene, which made people doubt their instincts. Over the years, I've spoken to psychologists who studied her behavior patterns. They describe her as a blend of narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial traits, and compulsive lying rooted in trauma. She didn't just want money. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted to be needed, worshipped, feared, and trusted all at once. What fascinated me most is how she built her environment to support her illusion. The house itself was part of the manipulation, tidy, old-fashioned, filled with religious images and children's books. Everything whispered innocence. That's environmental conditioning, creating a physical space that disarms suspicion. Even her appearance, a soft grandmother with neatly permed hair, was a costume. The psychology of appearance in criminal deception is profound. When someone fits a cultural archetype of trust, teacher, nurse, grandmother, the cognitive dissonance between how they look and what they do creates blindness in observers. That blindness protected Dorothea for years. When the truth finally surfaced, the shock wasn't just about the crimes. It was about the betrayal of expectation. Society isn't prepared to see an elderly woman as a predator. We are conditioned to view nurturing and violence as opposites. Dorothea fused them, proving how fragile that boundary really is. In her trial, prosecutors painted her as a monster, but what haunted me most was her calm insistence that she only tried to help. In her mind, she was still the savior. That delusion, so unshakable even in the face of evidence, shows the ultimate form of ego preservation. When narcissism reaches its peak, reality itself becomes negotiable. I remember reading through the testimony of her surviving tenants. They described her as kind, attentive, and motherly. Even after learning what she had done, some struggled to accept it. That is the lasting power of psychological grooming. It doesn't just control behavior, it rewrites memory. Victims rationalized the abuse because the kindness felt real at the time. In behavioral terms, Dorothea Puente's manipulation followed a perfect cycle: identification, dependency, isolation, and control. She identified who needed her most. She created a dependency by meeting that need. She isolated them emotionally and financially. And finally, she decided their fate. Each step reinforced her self-image as a caretaker. Each act of mercy affirmed her authority. The psychology of that loop mirrors the same control seen in cult leaders, a closed world where she was the only source of comfort and power. What makes her story even more chilling is how functional she remained. She attended church, entertained guests, donated to charities. She lived in two realities simultaneously: the public illusion of benevolence and the private empire of control. That compartmentalization requires a level of mental discipline that borders on the sociopathic. When I analyze her final interviews, I notice subtle cues: the deflection of blame, the feigned confusion, the soft sighs when asked hard questions. These are hallmarks of a manipulator who has spent a lifetime perfecting performance empathy. Real empathy is spontaneous. Performative empathy is strategic. She could simulate concern because she studied it. Every gesture, every tone was mimicry. That mimicry is what allows individuals like Dorothea Puente to thrive unnoticed. They learn the external grammar of emotion, the smile, the tears, the sighs, without feeling the meaning behind them. In essence, they become emotional linguists fluent in a language they don't believe in. As I reflect on her case, I keep returning to one question: what truly satisfied her? Was it the money? The control? The adoration? The answer, I think, lies in something deeper: the illusion of being indispensable. Every person in her house needed her. Every government check, every meal, every dose of medication came through her hands. That dependency filled the void left by a childhood without stability. She created a world where she was the axis, where love and survival both revolved around her. That psychologically is both her motive and her madness. Dorothea Puente died in prison years later, still maintaining her innocence, still speaking softly, still the grandmotherly figure she had always played. She never acknowledged the darkness beneath her calm surface. To the end, she clung to her self-image as a caregiver wronged by a cruel world. And that is perhaps the most haunting element of all. She believed her own performance. When I close her file, I don't think of her as a monster. Monsters are easy to spot. Dorothea was something far more dangerous: a mirror reflecting how easily empathy can be imitated, how kindness can be corrupted when control becomes its hidden purpose. Her story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question about human psychology: how well do we really know the people who help us? Because sometimes the hands that feed us aren't feeding us to keep us alive. They're feeding us to keep us dependent. Whenever I walk past an old house with lace curtains and a tidy porch, I can't help but think of hers, the quiet rooms, the gentle voice, the false safety that hid a silent empire of control. Dorothea Puente didn't just kill for gain. She built a world where power masqueraded as kindness. And that world, once exposed, reminded us that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, offers you tea, and asks if you'd like sugar with it.